who is connecting once again because the internet likes to kick us out.
How do you
Thank
get
you all for your
kicked out
patience.
of your own presentation?
You had to make a an appearance. It worked out. It was very perfect.
That
Your
is
timing was perfect.
That is extremely dramatic, and I'm not dramatic. All right. Seems like it's my time to take the floor. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Thank you. That is amazing. First, I would like to say thank you for welcoming me to attend this meeting and provide some information to you all. I bring greetings from a bunch of folks at OSU at our center. As Ugochi said, I work at the Center on Education and Training for Employment. Our center houses a statewide family engagement center. It houses my team, the Equity Engagement and Evaluation team. I have Dr. Melissa Ross. She's on the background. She works with me on the Equity Engagement Evaluation team, and also, I believe, the Ready steering team that Ugochi mentioned. So I am here because we got an invitation to extend a learning experience to you all, and we are extremely excited to be able to engage in this work with you. So can we get started, Melissa, with the slides? Thank you. That's me. As Ugochi said, I am a research specialist at our center, and I call upon a lot of my training as a school psychologist, my work in communities, my work with schools and educators to create content that is meaningful for all of those buckets of individuals. So this learning experience today is specifically tailored towards educators. And so I like to really talk about kind of what are we going to be doing today? So let's go through our roadmap. We are going to explore the concept of race. There's a lot of ideas about what race is and those types of things. And we're kind of going to slowly unpack that race box. Then we're going to really explore some of the historical connections that have been made between race and education. Sometimes we're unaware of how interconnected they have been. And in order for us to try and disconnect them as educators, we've got to figure out how they've been intertwined. And then we're going to compare and contrast our own kind of conceptions of race and what it looks like in the history that we've understood and our own stories. And so we're going to kind of look at that stuff and figure out kind of where we've been, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. So I want to ask some questions of you all. I want you to think about, what did you know before you went to school? If preschool was your first school experience, really try to go back 3, 4, 5. If kindergarten was your first experience, go back there. Please use the chat. So what did you know before you went to school? Go ahead, drop it in the chat. I know I knew some of my ABCs. I knew a little bit of that. Melissa knew her colors, okay. I don't know if I had all of those down packed at that point. Ooh, letters, numbers, and started reading. Okay, okay. How to play with others. What toys, what toys you love. Okay, sharing, counting, good. Ooh, the importance of books. I love that. Okay, good. So a lot of us knew kind of those basics. Colors, maybe some numbers. We knew some songs. Sometimes we learned how to share, which could have been difficult. We understood how to be in a group with others and those types of things. So now let's see here. Tell me now what you learned before you went to school and if that was reinforced. So for those of you that knew your colors, your ABCs and those types of things, was that reinforced when you went to school? Was sharing one of those concepts that was universal and reinforced when you went to school? Okay, so the ABCs were ABCs, whether you learned them at home and they went to school, right? Colors were still colors. Sharing still required us to kind of engage in activities and those types of things. Okay, good. So when I learned my ABCs, I learned them in a song. But then when I went to school, I learned how to separate them out of a song and really kind of put them into A is for apple, those types of things. So it went from a lyric down to an actual thing. And then eventually I learned to pull those letters and put them on paper and make words. So yes, a lot of the stuff that we learn is very much reinforced when we actually go through formalized schooling. Next slide, Melissa. So today we're going to talk about race, okay? But before we really get started, I think it's important that we first address some of the common emotions that we have when we find ourselves in discussions with race, because these could be very difficult discussions, especially if we're not used to engaging in them. So sometimes we can feel a sense of anger. We don't want to be engaged in this. Sometimes we feel a sense of sadness because maybe we're learning some things that we didn't know, and we're kind of grieving what we didn't know, and now that we know it. Sometimes we still feel a sense of fear because we're afraid of making mistakes in these conversations and we're not quite sure how to navigate them. Some of us feel a sense of joy. We're like, we are grateful we are having this conversation, and it's very exciting that we're engaging in this. Sometimes we have our interests are piqued. It's kind of like, I'm not engaging these conversations. I'm not anxious, I'm not excited, but I'm very interested. Some of us feel kind of surprised. How did this conversation go towards race? I don't know what just happened, but it just turned on a dime. Some people feel a little sense of disgust for some reason or other. And then some of us feel a sense of shame. So going back to that sadness, some of us kind of have a sense that, you know, something was wrong and we were not aware of it. And so I want you to look at this list of, these are what we call basic emotions, and they are automatic emotions. So in psychology, we look at these emotions as emotions that we're hardwired to feel most of these 8 emotions as it relates to our response to a challenge or something that we face. So many times when we talk about race, we can see someone's response or countenance fall into one of those categories. But many times we don't really want to talk about race because it is difficult and we don't know where other people are. And so we might be excited, but someone else in our midst might be angry about it. So because our emotions can range in different ways, we tend to treat race like some very difficult conversations. So when I first got married, I got married when I was 20. My husband and I were both in college. He was in graduate school. I was in undergrad. And I never really wanted to talk about money. That financial talk was not the talk. So when it was time to sit down and go over the checkbook and pay the bills and those types of things and look at taxes, anger would be an emotion that I would exhibit, probably even shame. You know, we were still kind of building. And sometimes we treat race conversations like that. I had a sense of being overwhelmed having financial conversations, especially having being raised poor and not really understanding how to manage money. So sometimes our race conversations go towards that. Sometimes we treat race conversations like the talk that we have to have with our children. We just don't want to have that conversation. So we just don't have the conversation, or it's a very vague conversation, and we don't really want to engage in that conversation. Sometimes it's because we don't feel informed as parents that we could actually have that conversation, or we just don't want to have it. And then other times we treat race conversations like political conversations, where I cannot gauge your thoughts. So this feels kind of sketchy. I don't want to jump in. And race oftentimes is treated like a political conversation. It is a either or it is, I don't want to get into that conversation because it could be very controversial. So through this series, we're going to learn why it's going to be very important for us as educators to overcome that fear, to build our understandings of race, and to learn about the tools that we can use and how to deploy them so that our educational policies and our practices can acknowledge race and can acknowledge the impacts that race have on our students' experiences, but then how we can take that information and turn that into addressing the impacts of race in a culturally responsive way. So if we get to the end of this and we've done that, then we've done our job. So let's move on to the next one. So let's talk about race. We said we're going to talk about race. We said we were going to unpack this whole idea of race. So what is race? Scholars pretty much say that race is just a socially constructed concept that is made real by the social consequences. So there are some DNA folks who do work in DNA sequencing. And they said in June 2000 that the concept of race has no scientific or genetic basis. And so this really goes back to this idea that it's socially constructed. So there's no biological thing that race is. The National Geographic magazine, some of their scientists suggested that all of us humans are closely related, and that as humans, we have the same collections of genes with slightly different variations of them. And as time progresses, those variations get greater. So this is how we can have people who are lighter, people who are darker, and those types of things. Eventually, those genes mutate as they continue to go down the line. And so the things that we look at as race categories are just mutations, but we are more closely connected as humans than we are disconnected, which is why we can watch series about kind of Who's Your Family and all those fun DNA series. And we see there's a lot of there's some trees connecting all over the place. We see celebrity trees connecting with other trees, and we see white trees connecting with Black trees. We are very, very, very connected. And so race, this whole idea of race was created intentionally so that we can put things in buckets and tie privilege or tie benefits and then tie consequences and those types of things. And we're going to talk more about that. So let's think about, what are the social consequences? I mean, I don't know what a social consequence is. What are the social consequences of race? Well, they're the things that we think about in education. They're the things that we think about in our work. There are disparities that we see across many fields. There are discriminations that occur across many experiences, and there are those systemic barriers that we talk about. Oftentimes we talk about that in education. And really, there are scholars that say that the concept of race just signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests that are referred to different types of human bodies. And so we can see that when we can really look about, I love education because we love talking about all the gaps, right? The gaps in education are the disparities based on race, the discrimination based on race, and the barriers. And so we're going to talk about those social consequences a little later, and we're really going to talk about them in terms of educational experiences and just experiences based on race across the lifespan, because I think it really makes a difference that we look at it through that lens. So let's start off by building our racial awareness. We said we were going to do that. We've talked about race. So let's start kind of putting some more learning blocks to that. So if we think about our students as a whole child, and I loved when ODE came out with a whole child framework, which really is connected to that whole ecological systems theory, where we have this child in the middle, but every single thing, every single system outside of that child impacts that child's experience. It also impacts the child's educational experiences, the experiences outside of the school. And so when we think about our students as a whole child, we've really got to start considering the things, those systems that impacts that child, which is why it's important for us to really understand this whole concept of race and how it's been almost weaponized to provide for some and disadvantage other ones. And our students definitely experience that. So many of us know this whole Plessy versus Ferguson. And if you don't know the Plessy versus Ferguson case, I'm going to explain it to you. Homer Plessy was a Black man who wanted to ride on a train in Louisiana. And he decided, of course, you know, we think about Rosa Parks, but he decided he did not want to ride on the Black only train because the accommodations on that train were not okay. They weren't good. He didn't like it. And so of course he traveled all over on over to the white train, because he felt like the accommodations in the Black train were not equal to the accommodations in the white train. And so of course he was not allowed to do that. And so he sued. His case eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And he lost. But what was interesting about the case was that when the Supreme Court ruled, they essentially ruled based on this social consequence of race. They basically said the law cannot make someone basically equal to another that is inherently inferior. And so what the Supreme Court basically said is that we can't say that Black people are the same as white people, so therefore they should be able to ride in trains with white people. And we can't make them on the same plane, so we can't rule that they can ride together. But there was one dissent vote, even though he lost, there was one dissent vote. And the dissent vote basically said the law basically cannot be race focused. It must be colorblind, essentially, which this is the only time you'll see me really kind of get behind colorblind thinking. And the dissent basically said the law does not see race because race was not real. It was made up. And so even though Plessy versus Ferguson did not go the way that that we would have wanted, it really set the groundwork for our work as educators and the way that we see race and education put together. That was a case that was pivotal to what we later learned to be Brown versus Board of Education. And so let's talk about that. So Brown versus Board of Education, you all know about. But let's really think about this. Did the connection between race and education begin with that separate but equal rule? So we have the Plessy versus Ferguson, and then that eventually went to Brown, and we'll talk about that. But do we really think that those two things were connected just in that space? I'm going to tell you that they weren't, and we're going to explore that later on. Race and education have been connected for as long as time has been. When we think about slavery and the impacts of slavery, we have to also remember the fact that there were rules that slaves could not read. It was illegal for them to have literacy. And we know literacy is the building blocks of education. I mean, reading, knowing how to read, understanding what you're reading is liberating. And not only is it the means through which you learn, but it's also the means through which you go through life. It is a passport through many things. And so that connection to race and education started well before Brown, but it was bought into Brown. So let's talk about Brown. So Brown versus the Board of Education, if you didn't know, essentially said that the separation of public schools was unconstitutional. So it led the way, of course, to desegregating schools. But I don't know if many of you knew, Brown was on the books for a long time. And Brown actually had some different iterations to it. So they kept going back to the Supreme Court because then they needed a mechanism to actually implement Brown because schools were not willing to do it on their own. But what was fascinating about Brown is that schools and parents began to find a way around that. So they started creating private schools and different schools so that they did not have to integrate and have Black and white students together. I put Getting Around Brown up here for you because it is a wonderful book. It's a book that I had to read going through my graduate studies. And it is related right here to the state of Ohio. It explores the way that Columbus City schools, right after the Brown ruling, delayed segregation in the district. It talks about some other districts, so you might find your district talked about in this book. It's a really wonderful book. But it really talks about how there was a lot of effort to continue keeping Black students from white students. And it talks about how when integration finally occurred, then we started seeing kind of white flight going to suburban places, just because we did not believe that Black students and white students should be mixed together. But I will tell you this, that in Brown, you'll find that the Black community was made to essentially create their own educational system because there was a desire to keep everyone separate. But when integration started, Black schools started getting less qualified teachers, less qualified white teachers, and teachers who would not stay for a really, really long time. And so what we can see in this book is, in our state, we can start seeing the history of how students' educational experiences were impacted and interrupted by the idea that there was some inferiority about Black students and Black families. But before Brown, we had this whole notion that there were Black colleges and white colleges. And I love our outgoing Secretary of Education said that HBCUs, so historically Black colleges and universities, were like the forerunners for school choice. But in all actuality, Black colleges were created because white college students couldn't go, or I'm sorry, Black colleges were created because Black college students couldn't go to white colleges. And the seeds of Brown, going from Plessy's to Brown, also occurred where there were cases where they were predominantly white, or I should say all white colleges that would not accept Black students. And so these cases also went to the Supreme Court. And what was amazing was the acrobats that white colleges would engage in. So they would even say, and this is in history, if you want to look it up, they would say, we'll create a separate college. So they would lose and they would say, okay, so we'll create a separate college for Black students to go to, because they just did not want to mix races. There was just an inherent belief that Black students were not the same as white students and they needed to be kept separate. So we can see the perpetuation all the way from slavery, from Plessy, through kind of HBCU experiences, through Brown, and we can see the perpetuation and the consequences of race. And so have you guys ever wondered how Brown became Brown? Like, how do we get there? How do we get this system that created this disadvantage? And how is this system kind of maintained? So I think what's more important of the how is the why. This is where we find out how deeply ingrained the connections between race and beliefs, and how those play out in policy and in law, and how they play out in our practices. So if you all didn't know, the NAACP, they were the sponsors of many of those Supreme Court cases with Thurgood Marshall and those types of things. And they were considered the architects of the separate and not equal kind of position that Brown actually used. So Thurgood Marshall, in his defense of separate but not equal, leveraged the work of two prominent Black psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They were two Black psychologists who engaged in a lot of race and education work before it was ever any cliche to do that. And you all may have heard of some of their work. They did the famous Clark-Doll test, where we essentially see the concept of race playing out in the minds of preschoolers. This is why it's important that we understand what we learned before we went to school, so that we can understand what is being reinforced or what is being dispelled when we get there. So what was amazing about the Clark-Doll test was it was with preschoolers, and they presented these preschoolers with a white doll and a Black doll, both Black and white preschoolers, by the way. And they would ask them questions like, which doll is pretty? Which doll is ugly? Which doll is clean? Which doll is dirty? Which doll is good? And which doll is bad? And they also asked them, which doll is most like you? Overwhelmingly, regardless of the race of the child, the children chose the white doll. Black children chose the white doll. as pretty, as clean. And many times they chose the white doll as someone that was like them, even though, of course, they didn't look that way. And so when Dr. Clark started really asking questions of the Black children about why they would say they look like the white doll, they would say, well, they're a Negro or whatever. But then even for those children that eventually did begrudgingly say that they were more like the Black doll, when they did it, they were emotional. Now, these are 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. They were emotional. Many were in distress. Many were crying. And the reasons that they gave to Dr. Clark as to why they didn't want to be associated with the Black doll was the negative connections that were already formed in their mind about being Black. And so from that research, the Clarks essentially found that segregation made Black children feel inferior, and that segregation also negatively impacted their learning. So keeping Black and white students separately did a psychological thing and kind of an educational thing to our students. But I also wonder what it does to our white students who also see this, because we know that the white students also said that the white dolls were pretty, they were clean, they were nice. And so we know that when we enter into formal education, we already have made some connections in our little minds, all of us, Black and white, about who has value and who doesn't, who is clean and who is not clean, who is preferred and who is not preferred. So I would like us to really consider what's happening right now today as we process this information, because segregation really just means that we are separate from, or we are separate from a main body or group. This creates the whole idea of something being exclusive. And who is the main body or group? Well, who is clean, who is pretty, who is nice, and who do we want to be most like? So when we segregate, sometimes we're feeding into these negative connections to race. And we're going to talk about how segregation is still occurring in our classrooms today, in our practices today, and how we can really kind of change that. So let's talk about some learning assumptions. When we teach what we were taught. And I will tell you, everything that you know, you have been taught. If it wasn't directly or indirectly, you have learned, definitely. Teaching occurs when something is learned. I had a really, really good undergraduate professor, Dr. Marvin Miller, and he said, the only time you've ever taught is if somebody has learned. If your students haven't learned, then you have not taught. So I know that if we're really good teachers, our students are learning something. Learning occurs when the result can be repeated at will. I remember talking to my son and daughter about this for math. It's like, you have not learned multiplication unless I can give you a multiplication problem with pizza outside on a paper. You can do a lattice, you could do, all types of things. When you have learned, it does not matter what situation you're in. You can produce whatever the desired results are at will. So eventually what we do when we learn things, we form these unconscious competencies. How many times do you find yourself doing math and you just, okay, well, we got 24 pieces of cake. I mean, if you're like me, I'm looking around, I already know we don't have enough cake, but I'm hoping I can get the piece before everyone else does. So we're engaging in these incompetent competencies all the time. But as educators, we also teach what we learn. But as we said earlier, we learn formally and both informally. And we know that the children in the Clark doll test have learned a lot of things informally well before they ever went to school. And this is how we come to school with knowledge of certain types of things and peoples and groups. So I'll tell you, as a school psychologist student, when I was doing my practicum, I used to start the special education process for a local Head Start. So that child find process, I would start kind of that process and saying, hey, this is a student you might need to put on your radar to potentially evaluate. And I would take these little preschoolers, and many of them were new to school, and they were new like they were like fresh out the package 3-year-olds, right? And so really the thought is that they're fresh, this type of thing. But I would screen these children and I would ask questions about things that they were expected to know. Even though they had never went to school, there was an expectation that they entered formal schooling with some type of knowledge before they got there. I mean, you all know in kindergarten, we do these tests. Some of our students don't go to preschool. They come in kindergarten, we're already kind of doing these tests to see what do they know? Why? Because we know they learn before they come. And so I would test these students on things, and I would ask questions and those types of things. And so what we know is that they're coming with knowledge, and we are either reinforcing it, or we're confirming it, or we're disproving it. So think about it. What have you learned that you have probably disproved? Or better, what have you learned that you have potentially confirmed in your mind? Many times when we try to prove something is when we find out that it's not true. It is in the asking of whether or not this is true or not that sometimes we find the very thing that we have learned and we have subconsciously, competently been able to deploy, we find out that, okay, that wasn't really true. This happens in research all the time. We start off with a strong hypothesis. Where do we get a hypothesis from? From previous work or previous researchers and those types of things. And then we go out to prove it. And I'll tell you, I always tell people, it doesn't matter what your findings were. Most scholars don't want to write up that their hypothesis failed, but it's learning nonetheless. It is amazing to kind of get that out to the field and say, hey, we thought this because of this, but we actually proved this not to be true. And sometimes it's in the inquiry that we're able to really explore the connections that we made. And we start finding that they're not quite as accurate or right as our minds have made them to be. And so how do we teach race? So we talked about, everything we learn, we've been taught, and teaching occurs when our students learn, and learning occurs when the result can be made and presented at will. So how are we teaching race? Well, we can learn informally, right? So students are learning by watching. They're watching what you do. Students learn by hearing. They're watching what we say. And students are learning sometimes by the way that something sits with them, by how it feels. And so they're using their interactions in the way that they are treated. And many times these are triggers in their mind about who's pretty, who's clean, who's nice, who's valued, who's preferred. We know that race is learned because over the summer, many of our students and their parents explained, we learned this with George Floyd, they explained how their students were learning race in our schools. They wrote anonymous letters. They wrote them district level, classroom level, those types of things. And we have to really start asking if the connections that we made, if we're teaching them, and if the connections are accurate, because I will tell you, when our students start writing those letters, my children were on Twitter, and they were able to read some of their peers' letters and those types of things. And if you don't know what those letters are, students across the US, not just in the state of Ohio, started going to social media and writing Dear School letters. And those letters contain specific experiences that they were able to point to of engagement that was based on race. And what I loved about those letters were, it wasn't just Black students, it was white students and other students. And they were saying, hey, had this interaction in your classroom. That was kind of not good. I felt like that was based on race. And they were really explaining what they've experienced in our schools. Parents were also taking to social media. And so if we don't think that we've learned who's pretty, who's valuable, who's nice, who's preferred. And if we don't think we're teaching it, our students and our parents have told us we are, and we're doing a really good job at it too. I mean, folks are producing that result at will. They're doing it in a lunchroom. They're doing it in a library. They're doing it on a bus. And so for us, the question has to be, what are both Black and non-Black students learning about race in our classrooms? What are they hearing? What are they seeing? What are they feeling that we may not know that is being conveyed to them? What are they learning about race when we start putting in certain policies? What are they learning about race when we engage certain groups and not other groups? What are they learning about race when they hear teachers talking in the hallway about, those parents? We have to ask ourselves those questions, those hard questions. And remember, we fear those conversations, we're excited about those conversations, we have joy about those conversations, but they're critically necessary. And the conversation really has to start with us. Equity in the Center is a center that does work on equity issues, on race. And they have this framework. It's called Awake to Woke to Work. And it's essentially this framework that tells us how we can move from getting awake to being woke and actually deploying some of this stuff around equity in our work. And that's something I think as educators we can do to really start addressing some of those things that we heard this summer that's occurring in our classrooms, in our lunchrooms, in our libraries, and those types of things. So in the Awoke to Work, there are levers. They talk about them as levers, but we can consider them as kind of like pinch points or moving parts. So the center's framework is all about transformation. And so I would like to really focus on, they have this major framework. It's major. We'll give you all the link to it. But there is there's a learning piece that they really focus on that I really like to focus on, the learning environment lever. So the awake part deals with us as people. Our tendency when we start talking about race and we start talking about the experiences our students had, and we really start kind of really going through the reality of what's been going on, our tendency is to say, we got to change the system. I mean, and we're system people, right? We're like, okay, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this. But really the work starts with us. And it starts with people, because people create cultures, and the cultures are what eventually leads to the systems. And so if we jump to the system and really don't do that people work, we're going to always be going too quick to try and find a solution that, quite frankly, will not hold. And so can you go back to that slide, Melissa? Thank you. And so in the people space, we increase our individual knowledge and our personal level of knowledge of racism and bias in us. And when I say us, I mean all of us, all of these beautiful 48 people I'm looking at, 47 people I'm looking at on this screen, all of us. Really kind of sitting with, what do we know, and what are we doing, and what are our bias? And I will tell you, we all have it. I tell my students quite often, because I teach a lot of this with my graduate students, and I tell them I have to check my bias all the time, because I watch TV, and I won't tell you which station I prefer, but I watch TV, and there'll be a major event. There'll be a shooting. And my mind is already like, okay, I already know. And then they actually start showing the person that was the shooter. And I'm like, okay, that was some extreme bias I had. And so I'm constantly checking my own to make sure that the connections that I'm making are accurate, and that I'm not coming to conclusions based on some loose kind of conception of things. The culture piece really talks about understanding the dominant culture. And in doing so, we can then kind of reduce the emotional labor that is placed on our Black families and students and people of color in general, related to kind of race issues. And then that work piece that goes across systems, that allows us to critically reflect on the progress and be very intentional about sustaining the work of race equity. But if we don't do that top portion, if we don't wake up, if we don't do our people work, we won't ever get to the system. We'll be kind of navel gazing and we'll talk about this problem, but we really won't get involved with kind of creating the solution. And so, Melissa, we should be on slide 15. I don't know if that's your slide 15. Because we are actually at a time where we are going to take a break.
This is what I have for slide 15.
All right. So we are going to, we're going to take a quick break. I want you all to be able to really sit with what we talked about a little bit. Get a snack, get some coffee, work through things in your mind, have the conversation with yourself that she ain't really on the right place. I don't really believe what she's saying, or she's really saying what I've been thinking. And then we're going to come back in about 10 minutes. So around maybe 9:55. And then we're going to start talking about the work we have to do, how we're going to wake up. And so I'll see you all back in about 10 minutes. Welcome back, folks. So this is like the Oscars and the Emmys. We're not having wardrobe malfunction. We're having technical difficulties. We're going to pull these slides back together. We realized we were working on 2 different versions. I'm glad that I memorized stuff. So what I want to do is just chat before we get the slides back up. How are we feeling? We know we have those 8 emotions. Some of us are probably feeling emotions outside of those 8 emotions. Please feel free to put that in the chat. Race talk for me in general is very exhilarating. I'm excited to be able to do it with folks, whether they're like toe dippers, just kind of getting into the water, or people that just dive right in. So how are we feeling? Malik said, you going? All right, thank you, Barbara. All righty. Yeah, so let me tell you all about the experience that we have going on at our center, which you've heard a little bit about, but I want to explain it to you. I love that you all are open with your students about having race conversations. So we started this work at OSU, of course, like many organizations. Some of you probably did this as well. We released a statement. We said, you know, we're going to do this work. I think many people stopped at the statement. And I think many people stopped at statements for 2 reasons. One, or 3. One, the statement was all they were going to do. 2, they had good intentions, but just didn't know how to start it. And 3, it was overwhelming. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to have these conversations and then to kind of have the conversations and move this conversation from words on a paper to actions and those types of things. And so in our center, we said, we're not going to just do a statement. We're going to do some work. We immediately created a steering team of, as I say with you all, folks that were ready to dip their toe in the water, people that were ready to dive in, and people who had already been swimming in the pool. And we said, those are people we want to get together and we want to start creating a structure for this. And what we found was this. There was excitement, there was fear, there was anger. There was anger, not just, so you would assume it was just Black people that were angry. There was some of our white colleagues that were angry because they had long histories with some of us, of their Black colleagues, and just didn't know. And some of the experiences that we were sharing with them was baffling. And so we just said, let's get in here. We're going to do this thing. and we're going to step on each other's toes. It's going to be a sweaty, nasty, crying, but we're going to do this. Why? Because we needed to get our house in order before we can go outside and start telling other people to get their house in order. And we engage in with a work with a lot of educators, a lot of professionals, a lot of community agencies. We engage in work within our university as well. And we needed to be able to do our work. And so we saw this all the way through to the point where our associates, we developed and are just beginning to deploy our Ready movement. As Ugochi mentioned, our associates are going to be engaging in that over the next several months. And it is customized content that we created that was curated by a multiracial team at our center who said, we're going to get in here, we're going to do this work, and we're going to talk about this. And when I tell you some of the conversations were tense, they were extremely tense and they were painful. And there were times someone who's been engaged in this work for quite some time, who has had very strong personal experiences with race. There were times that I said, whoo, this is rough. But we jumped back in. And there were times that we had to have cameras off because emotions were very high. In the workplace, this is an appropriate place to have these conversations. It is appropriate to start having these conversations about race because we are all impacted by it. And so we decided we're going to get in here, we're going to do this work. I will tell you, we are grateful that we did it. We are closer as a team and as a center. We feel like we really know each other now. And our white associates have come along this journey. Melissa, Dr. Ross and I, and a couple of our Black associates have come along this journey. And we said, we're going to make this a family, and family's going to have tough discussions, and we're going to say some dumb stuff. And there have been times that we've come back and we have had to have offline conversations with each other and just say that offended me. But because we were wanting and willing to do this work, those conversations were easier. But a lot of the stuff, a lot of the work, the emotional toll that it took on us to be in a predominantly white center has been alleviated. Not 100%, but definitely the space is more welcoming and it's more sensitive to our experiences. And we're grateful that we have colleagues that are willing to do this work. So I am hoping that you all gain some type of sense of that, or tools that will get you to that point, or will really kind of have some things kind of move. So I think that would be great. Yeah, we can talk about making those spaces, definitely. So I think we're ready. This second part is going to be more interactive. So we're really going to be using the chat, and we're really kind of going to be talking about some things. If you're a toe dipper, then just give me a smiley face. If you're a diver, then you're probably going to be writing paragraphs. And if you've been swimming in it, then just give me a succinct version of your comments. All right, Melissa, you ready? Thank you. So we took our break. Hopefully, I'm a coffee drinker. I don't know if y'all folks are tea drinkers. I never understand that, but hopefully you had a good break. You got a chance to eat something. I actually don't know what is on that picture. I probably wouldn't eat it, but it was a beautiful break looking picture, so we put it on there. So let's go back and let's ask some questions. We talked about awake, coffee is for the win. Yes. We talked about awake, awoke, and moving forward. So regardless of how you prefer to wake up, you wake up. So let's use the chat. Do you wake up before the alarm? Do you wake up with the alarm? Or are you a snoozer? And I'm going to side eye all the snoozers, just so you know. All right, come on before the alarm, people. Snooze all the time. Snoozer times 3. Okay. The dog wakes you up. I got one of those too. So we all have different wake up patterns. You got some folks sometimes I am a wake up before. Sometimes I'm a wake up with, I'm like sitting there waiting. I'm not a snoozer. So like I said, regardless of how we prefer to wake up, because we do have a preference and then there's a reality, but regardless of how we prefer to wake up, you eventually wake up, right? So let me tell you a story. When my husband and I first got married, I told you all we were married fairly young. So we didn't have, the good thing about getting married young is we didn't have all these patterns that we had established. So we didn't have to break a lot of things, but there were definitely some things that we said, okay, we're different. So when we first got married, right after our honeymoon, we had our first married people argument. It was fairly quick. And so we kind of had to work through that. So with all the changes in our life, I didn't notice that my husband had put our alarm clock next to him on the nightstand. I mean, I guess it made sense. So he moved into the apartment a couple weeks before we got married. And then after we got married, I moved in. And so it was the first night back from our honeymoon. He was in his master's program. So it was about a 4-day honeymoon. And I had to go to work the next day. And so I woke up late. My first day back from work, I woke up late. So unbeknownst to me, my husband was a snoozer. So I'm a wake up with the alarm type person, but sometimes I need the alarm to go a little bit because, you know, when you're sleeping, you're like, what is that? And he didn't let it go enough. He would just roll over and press the snooze. And so in many ways, this conversation about race is like that. There are going to be about 3-ish levels of awareness as it relates to like the events that happen in our nation this summer, as I talked about, our students talked about. So in a sense, many of us don't wake up, or we don't want to wake up because there's something soothing about being under that cover. If you're like a warm sleeper, it's warm and it's just cozy. I'm more of a cold sleeper, so that crisp air just really lulls me to sleep. There's something comforting about sleeping, about not waking up. I mean, there just is. I mean, for people who are sleepers, I'm not a sleeper. I know people who can get in a marathon, they can sleep 12 hours. I'm confused about that, but I'm always feel like I'm missing something. But there is something essentially comforting about crawling into the bed, rolling under the cover, and really sleeping and wanting to be in that position. And it doesn't take much work for us to sleep. I mean, unless you have issues sleeping, you know, you lay down, you go to sleep, you close your eyes, it's good. But for some of us, the way that we wake up from sleeping is very disturbing. Some people, you know, like I said, you get up before the alarm, you're not disturbed. That snoozer, I don't know. But the folks that wake up with the alarm, sometimes it can be very, very drawing. When we saw the protests this summer, and there were many of them, and we heard the experiences of our students, there were some of us who already knew about that. There are people that fell in like one of those 3 groups based on the way that we wake up. Some of us had already woken up before that alarm went off. You know, some of us, that was not new news for us because racism was nothing new. And some of us had already been working under the fact that we were working under a system and trying to navigate a system. And so those people didn't need the alarm to wake them up. They had already been disturbed. And then you had some people who woke up after seeing that knee on the neck, or they started reading stories from the school, the children in their district, or they started receiving letters or emails. Sometimes they got phone calls from friends of that were not white saying, you know, we need to talk or something like that. But it was definitely something that was kind of jarring to the point where it hit home because you knew somebody personally that was tremendously affected. I had a lot of my white friends just text and say, you okay? How you feeling? Or do we need to talk, or what can I do? And so, you know, we had like those types of people, those people who they saw that event and it was baffling enough that it woke them up. And then you have the people who slowly wake up. These are our snoozers. They like, I mean, this looks like I should probably get up, but for some reason they're kind of slowly waking up to this. Those are my toe dippers, by the way. And sometimes people are waking up slowly because it's really hard to believe. It's hard to believe that this is what we're waking up to. For those of us who snooze, my husband, I love it. My husband gets up at 4:30 in the morning, and to watch him wake up, he's 43, but he acts like he's 60. But he wakes up in the morning, And he swings his leg over the bed and he literally sits looking like he's thinking, I cannot believe I'm up. And then it's just a slow progress. He goes into the bathroom and then he sits on the side of the tub. And it's just kind of like, he's a slow waker upper, which is why he's a snoozer. But in some ways, when we're doing that slow wake up, it's just that reality is so hard for us to really kind of deal with. And so we have to really figure out, were we up before? Was that event so jarring that we were awakened in such a disturbing way? And then are we kind of from that group who they're waking up, but it's just the environment outside of their sleep is unbelievable. And so what do? We know this stuff exists now. So what are we going to do? Well, the Equity in the Center says the first step is, and I talked about this before, is we gotta wake up. We gotta increase our own individual knowledge of racism and bias. So we are essentially saying we're gonna wake up to this. We're gonna start moving these levers. We're gonna start having these conversations, and we're going to start doing this work. You can go to the next slide. Now I'm gonna share this quote with you. Layla Watson said this quote: "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." Some of the issues that we see around having conversations around race and really doing this work in our organization, doing this work with ourselves, is sometimes we think about that we're doing it because we're helping the marginalized or the disenfranchised or our Black students or our Black families. But this is personal work. This is people work that we're doing. Because as I said before, systems don't change until the people in them change the systems. And sometimes our tendency around really engaging in this work is to make it mystical, where, it's going to be this magical thing where I'm going to come in here, I'm going to help you do this stuff, and it's all going to be better. But really, our position needs to be, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to do my work, and I'm going to move those levers so that my students' experiences will be a little different. And when I say students, I'm not just talking about Black students, I'm talking about all student experiences. Because again, all of our liberation is bound up together. Racism and things don't happen unless everybody is in the loop, so we gotta come together and liberate all of ourselves from these systems that we've been engaging in unknowingly for quite some time. So we're going to start unpacking the actions that people need to engage in that, or unpacking the actions that people engage in typically that reinforces race by either we're creating it or we're maintaining the social consequences that are tied to it. Because remember, race is a social construct made real by the consequences that are tied to it. And so the question I always ask is, how do we get here? Well, remember those little ones, right? Y'all said you learned your colors. Some of you learned your numbers. Some of us had the privilege of having kind of blocks and things at home. But what we know is that our brains are hardwired to categorize. They just are. I mean, I remember a school psychology professor say, we want to categorize everything. We want things to fit in buckets. We just do. And later we're taught we move from categorizing to preferences. So I'll tell you, as a child, I didn't eat seafood. We were raised poor. Seafood was a luxury. We didn't have it. And so I never really connected with the fact that I would always say I didn't like seafood, but I never really had it. But my mother didn't have seafood in the house. So for me, that preference kind of developed into, I'm not a seafood person. Later, of course, as an adult, I tried seafood. And I'm still not a major seafood person, but I love salmon. My family thinks I'm crazy. For any event, my birthday is coming up soon. My husband said, what do you want? I want salmon from Husband 29. I love salmon. I put it on salads. I love it. And so I found that this preference that I thought I had was really only based off of what I was not exposed to. And once I was exposed to it, I realized I had a different preference. I was a seafood person. I'm not a shrimp person, but I definitely was a seafood person. Now, I like salmon. I cook salmon in my house. So my children really are only exposed to salmon. My daughter started eating shrimp one day. I felt like she had betrayed us. I didn't understand where that came from because we only really cook salmon in the house. My children hate salmon. And so my son is not a seafood person. And I know that my children's preferences in some ways are very much impacted by what I expose them to. Thank you, Cindy. Go salmon. Likewise, we understand those categorizations and we put things in their buckets, and then we develop preferences based off of the environment and the way that we are taught formally and informally. Now, remember, those preschoolers knew. They knew. They start categorizing fairly soon in that Clark-Doll test. They had learned how to do that. So what categorizations do we have in our mind, and what connections have we made that may prevent us, from truly seeing our students and our families through their experiences? Because we definitely have some things churning in these wonderful brains of ours that have made strong connections and preferences that sometimes does not allow us to really see our students' experiences. And so like, those are the questions we have to ask. But remember, I want to go back to this. We teach what we learn. I mean, that's basically what we did. Everything we know we've been taught, we are teaching when something is learned, and learning occurs when our students can produce it at will. What categorizations are we using in our minds that's impacting our preferences? So as educators, I know y'all can really appreciate this next slide. So terms that we love to use in education: grit. I remember when a book came out a couple of years ago, everybody was walking around with this book on grit. It was a beautiful book too. I actually looked at it and said I might read it, and then I said, well, maybe I won't. We like to talk about perseverance. Woo, that student right there, she just perseveres through everything. And if we don't talk about resilience, we don't talk about anything else. Our students, we talk about grit, perseverance, and resilience. So grit, let me tell you, so we'll get back to that, but grit is considered a personality trait that helps our students keep moving towards long-term goals despite any setbacks or failures. That's grit. They're gritting through it, right? Perseverance is the act or power of continuing to do something in spite of difficulties, but it also means to continue a course of action with little to no prospect of success. And then resilience. That's the ability to bounce back. Dr. James Moore at OSU does a lot of work in the resilience of Black male students. And he just says, it's just bounce back, it's bounce back, it's bounce back. It's bounce back from stress, adversity, failure, challenges, and even trauma. So what common things are our students overcoming and working through? So I think when we start talking about grit, perseverance, and resilience, we have to talk about the fact that we are applauding our students, and we are elevating them and celebrating them, giving them rewards and awarding them for having these characteristics. But what are we really rewarding them for is the question. So we talked about moving those levers, and that first lever is the personal work. And so now we're going to talk about what I'm making these words up, what they're gritting through, what they're resilient through, and what they're persevering through. Can you go to the next slide, Melissa? This is what they're getting the applause for. Many of our Black and brown students, this is what they're working through. So when we consider that first step of waking up, we got to be brutally honest with what many of our Black students are experiencing in our educational spaces, because many of them are going to be physically present in your classroom, in your building, in your bus, in your district, but they're going to be excluded from a variety of activities. So we look at the top of that iceberg. Most of us, those are the things that we call explicit bias. Those are the things that are explicitly racist. They're explicit acts, and we would all agree slavery was wrong, definitely racist. Jim Crow laws, kind of, that was Plessy versus Ferguson, that was excluding Black children from being in schools to white children. That was wrong, right? But it doesn't occur to us that some of those things are still impacting our students, even at the top. Those hate crimes, some of our students are experiencing that now. And it's impacting who they are and how they kind of move around, even in our spaces. Crime may not have happened with them in our schools, but it's definitely impacting them. In some of our schools, our students are still experiencing exclusion by some of those things up top. Their peers are saying racist jokes. Their peers are using the N-word. People are using racial slurs. And perhaps you've probably been in the presence of someone, or maybe you even engage in those top kind of explicit behaviors as well. Really, that below the surface stuff is what we have to talk about. When we're talking about, let's have conversations on race, when we're talking about what our students are gritting through, persevering through, and resilient through, we're talking about that stuff on the bottom. So let's talk about that. So below the surface is kind of those things. And these are the things that are propelled by our unconscious bias, those competencies that we engage in, those connections, those preferences that may or may not be real or true. These are the ways that we may not know that we are excluding our Black and brown students and their families. So let's just look at color blindness. So that color blindness is the position where people say, I don't see race. Some people, well-meaning people, we've had colleagues say, I don't really see race. And I think that comes from a sense that I want to see everybody, right? It's a well-intentioned perspective to have. But did you know that color blindness, the actual color blindness, people who are colorblind, means that they generally are more sensitive to certain colors and less sensitive to other colors. So they're not necessarily not seeing, like they're not seeing a clear world or, a white world, because if they're seeing a white world, they're seeing a color. If their preference is like the green, blue, their eyes are only picking up on those colors. So when we talk about being colorblind, what we are really saying, if we're really using the term the way that it's used in medical circles, is there is a preference in color blindness to certain things, certain colors, certain experiences, those things. And that means that we don't detect other ones. And I will tell you, I personally see color blindness as one of the most damaging perspectives that we could ever have, because what it does is it erases the impacts of the experiences that some of our marginalized students have had. It says, I see you here and now, but I don't see anything that has impacted you up until you got with me. But we know the ecological theory, right? We know everything impacts our students' experience, not just when they're in our classroom, but when they're outside of our classroom, before they got to our classroom, and those types of things. So microaggressions, those are the acts that occur every day. Micro, macro, those types of things. They're insulting and they're demeaning messages. And many times those are also unintentional. And even though well-intentional people who profess that they have a desire to kind of engage in equality and equity still engage in microaggressions. And I'm gonna give you some examples of many that I have experienced. Mispronouncing your student's name or simply just renaming them because it's easier for you. So you might have a student in your classroom for the first 9 weeks, and it's a difficult name. Many of our foreign students have this issue as well, so this is not unique to Black and brown students. It is not putting yourself in a position where you are honoring their presence and their culture by simply learning their names. Black people in particular get this microaggression when we just get thrown some other Black person's name because we just both happen to be two Black people in the same space or two Black students. That is a microaggression, and it comes off as, I'm not important enough for you to accurately place my name with my face and who I am. It is having certain debates in your classrooms where students from a minoritized group's opinion may be different than the dominant group. And so putting students in a position where they are defending a whole something and not being very sensitive to the fact that that debate in and of itself can be traumatic to those students. That is a microaggression. Sometimes we see this when we're having conversations around immigration, and sometimes we have students in our classrooms whose families are immigrants or maybe undocumented, and not recognizing that that's putting them in a very precarious position where they are being excluded. It's just simply denying a student's experience by questioning their credibility. So if we're talking about race and someone is saying, hey, X, Y, and Z, it's just denying that that can't be true because I don't know that to be true. So it can't be true for you. That's microaggression. And then just assigning projects that just ignores the role of race. And I'll tell you, we do that quite often, not even understanding that we're doing it. I remember my son had a book project. They got to choose the book that they wanted to do for this book project. And he chose Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, one of my favorite books in school. I have to tell you, my husband was an English teacher, so our son knew a lot of books and a lot of different texts before most of his peers did. And if you've never read that book, there is some discussion around colonization and slavery. And my son loved that book. Well, we were asked for him not to do that for his book report. And we didn't understand why, but then we had to have a conversation around the fact that this book had won so many literary awards, and many of the other books that students were using in the class had also won those awards. And my son loved that book, and he really connected to it as a Black student. And so just ignoring that those connections are there for our students, and not really, allowing them to kind of to bring their culture, their perspective into the classroom can be very microaggressive. Gatekeeping. In my profession as a school psychology, we talk about this all the time. We talk about it in terms of professionals. We keep out the people who are not good for the profession, and we try to bring the people in who are good. So gatekeeping in education occurs when we just identify certain students that we think are better to engage in certain educational opportunities or having access. We can think about this in terms of who we refer for AP classes, who we allow to massage the boundaries to get into those gifted and talented classes, how we identify students for special education. All of those different students that we say, we need a leader, we need someone that can represent the school, those types of things. Having access to those things or not having access is some of the ways that we gatekeep. I mean, I know like in our center, we often talk about hiring people. And we talk about that we don't really want to use the term, they would fit well with our team. What does that mean? What does that mean when someone doesn't fit well with the team? It's the same thing with gatekeeping in education. When we're asked to refer or to say this student would do well with this, what are we using in our minds to determine their fit with that thing? And sometimes when we are not referring Black and Brown students, we're still making those connections sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they're not just quite there for any other reason. And we're going to talk about how this happens. There's some research about how this happens, but that is a implicit kind of act that we also do. The white savior complex, we talked about that before. That is essentially where we are going to come in and we're going to save these Black kids from all of this stuff. We are going to bring them in and we're going to save them. If you ever watched the movie, the Freedom Writers, that's what that movie did. You had a white English teacher that was coming in and she was going to teach these Black kids how to journal and write. They were Black kids from the inner city. And she just thought if I teach them how to write, it's going to change their world. And so we position ourselves as someone who is here to save, not someone who's here to link up, not someone who's here to help and come alongside, but we're going to save you. And so like in some ways with the Freedom Writers, do we think that once we get a Black student to read well and write well and things like that, they're going to transition out of the middle class, they're going to transition out of racist things? Probably not. But this is how we see segregation occurring kind of in some of our practices, where We are unknowingly engaging in these implicit acts that could be potentially impacting, traumatizing, damaging, and putting our students in a position where they're going to have to grit through it. They're going to have to persevere through it, and they're going to have to resile through it. So when we're talking about those terms, sometimes it's these barriers that we erect and that we maintain, that they are actually having to persist through. A lot of my research, my personal research, is about the persistence of Black female students in education. And I will tell you, most of my findings are based on race, and they're based on these things. And so, you know, when we're talking about persistence, let's have some conversation about what exactly those students just persisted through. It's easier to say they were homeless than it was to say they had issues with race in the classroom, they had issues with race in the school. You know, they were bullied, and they persisted through it, but they were bullied because students didn't like them because they were Black. And so I've been talking for a while. I want to ask you all a question. How might our implicit biases show up in our interactions with our students and our family? So I gave you some examples, but how might they show up? And I'll get it started. I used to sub. I love being around students. My goodness. My thing was going to be either I was going to be a teacher or a school psychologist, and I decided to go with the school psychologist. But I subbed quite often, and you know, y'all know, y'all teachers, y'all chatted up in the teachers' lounge. And so I would go in a teacher's lounge. I was kind of an outsider, but I went in anyway. And I heard a teacher talking about, you know, those Somalian students don't have any like training at all. I mean, some of the stuff they turn in is just, they're not good writers. And I was appalled. But this was the teacher's implicit bias showing up, kind of broad brushing all of her Somalian students as poor writers and students that weren't well trained. And so it just kind of popped up with there. Yes, normalized culture. Mm-hmm. How else might our implicit biases show up in our interactions with our students and our family? So we have a lot of interactions with them. Mm-hmm. We create a lot of in and out groups. We do. Unknowingly, we create these groups, and we just have no idea. Think about parent-teacher conference, and think about the parents who are mingling around, who are known, and those who are not known. Think about, you know, the signals we're getting off that you're welcome here, you're not welcome here. Absolutely the resources we choose. We're going to talk about that later on. Our selection of just classroom materials, down to the books that we put on our bookshelves, to the curriculum that we use. Ooh, treating students of color as representatives. Yes, 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 yes. For the entire race. All of us. All of us. Yes. What? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jack. We talk about that, where white people are positioned as just one, but Black people are often positioned as like, you represent every single one of us. Defining why people do not show up to meetings or conferences. Oh, yes. I got a lot of that. Well, why wouldn't she show up? It's so important. She must don't care. Well, her daughter died. That actually happened. Her daughter died. I mean, she's dealing with trauma and grief. Thank you. Type of music. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about discipline and special ed referrals. Thank you so much, Jenny. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Y'all are dropping some good ones in there. Thank you. Ooh, agreed disability in our students. Yes, 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 yes. Y'all are going down my lane. I love this. I could be on here all day with y'all, all day long. So then let's talk about these implicit bias. He's a Black son I never had. I love it. All right, so let's talk about these implicit bias. So why do they matter? Well, we can see y'all are talking about how they show up right in our classroom. So let's really talk about what they are. So they're just attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in unconscious ways. That means that that's those competencies that we're working through that sometimes we can't pinpoint, but man, is impacting everything that we do. And so I just put a couple things here on the screen for you to really look at. as it relates to implicit bias. Why does it matter? Well, has anybody ever driven to work on autopilot before? And you said, I don't know how I got there. When we were back in the office, my office is off for 315. There were many days I had music playing. I had thoughts going in my head. I was probably trying to read a text as it was going through the phone and thinking about something I needed to do. And I would park and I would think, how in the world did I get here? My body was on autopilot. It was driving. I could not remember any scenery. There could have been accidents. I didn't even see them. I was just 315. That is how our implicit biases work. They are automatic. We go to them immediately. And they're going to create those preferences. Now remember, the salmon, seafood, I didn't know I actually like seafood. That was an inaccurate preference that I thought I had. They are concealed and suppressed beliefs. These are things that are operating. You know how you have a computer? These are things that are operating when the computer looks like it's shut down, and it's not. They're still working. They can create really major barriers, not only for ourselves, but for our students. Go back and think about that iceberg situation. You know, the gritting, the resilient, and the persistent. And even when we have said, I'm going to do this work, I'm going to do this equity work, I'm getting in here, I'm not a toe dipper, I'm jumping in. If we don't deal with those implicit biases, then they're going to disrupt any work that we want to do with our students, with ourselves, and those types of things. I think it's important that we understand that a lot of these sometimes are not intentional. Sometimes they are, but many times they're not. We don't even know that these things are located in the recesses of our mind. And this is how we can get to institutional types of things. Now, remember, the equity in the center, we believe, using that framework, you move from the individual, you don't jump to the institution because you have to do this work here. But this is how we can see how eventually, because remember, people make cultures. We create the culture that's in our building, in our district. Then we create policies. These things are not people. Institutions are not people. Institutions are filled with and led by people. And so people have to deal with people's stuff. And in order to move that needle, to have an institution, to have a climate that is less racialized, that is not filled with bias and inequities, we got to deal with the people. And if we don't interrupt our own biases and address them, then we're going to get them institutionalized and we're going to perpetuate it. And we're going to find ourselves unknowingly participating in this cycle that our students are experiencing. So let's have some conversation. We throw around the term systemic racism. So let's talk about that. That's like a buzzword right now. So essentially, systemic racism are policies and practices that are linked across institutions. If you don't understand anything from this, understand that these things are connected. It provides favorable outcomes for some and disadvantages for other one. If somebody's in favor, somebody's not in favor. I would like us to sit with that. If someone is favored, then someone is not. So if a person is favored, they're getting opportunities that someone else is not getting. And in this way, this is how we can see the stairs of privilege build the blocks of structural inequities and barriers that our Black and Brown students experience. So it is absolutely critical that we deal with our bias. So when we're talking about that grit, that perseverance, that resilience for our Black students, we're talking about those activities that our students engage in that allows them to succeed in spite of these things, in spite of institutional and systemic bias. Those are the things that we said that are below the surface. They're unreachable until we uncover them. Racism and bias is experienced at the individual level, but is manifested and perpetuated at the systemic level. So we experience it here, and when we don't deal with it here, we're going to manifest that thing out in every single practice that we do. This is how we end up with policies and practices that favor and disadvantage across these symptoms, across these systems. And so this is about our own personal awareness. It's about waking up, and it's about really kind of exploring this thing of race that some of us are just now waking up to. So let me give you some examples, and this is where we're going to spend some time on this next slide. I want to talk about the impacts of bias across the lifespan. So again, we think about our students, ecological, whole child, impacts, impacts, impacts. So our students arrive to school with the accumulation of protective factors that might aid them as they access their education. We love talking about protective factors, and we can name them. But one of the greatest risk factors is going to be race. For our Black and brown students, that's their greatest risk factor. It impacts birth to death. So systemic racism impacts our students, their parents, and their families. So when we think about our students going through that ecological sense, then we can see how they are not only impacted by our own bias, but that the bias that there is across those symptoms that are fueled by others. So let's look at birth. There was a study that determined when Black women were educated, so we're talking about educated Black women, they were still more likely to give birth to premature babies when compared to white women who only had a high school diploma. So in 2004, there was a connection made between the mother's experience with racism and her preterm birth. So we're talking about that these babies are cooking in this toxic, racist, kind of racialized, I should say, environment. So we think about those ACEs, the adverse child experiences. Our students are getting ACEs in the womb. And I'm so grateful that there is research emerging that is looking at race as an ACE factor, because our students are impacted, again, birth. We talked about preschool birth. And so let's think about our elementary school students. Well, going into elementary school, there was this is really preschool, but this is, our preschoolers are our little ones out the package. They're going to go to elementary school. A profound study was conducted by Yale that found that teachers exhibited implicit bias as it relates to their expectations of their students who would have challenging behaviors. They didn't have them. Their expectation of the students who would have them. And they found that if a student possessed 3 of these traits, that they were at the greatest risk. And you know what they were? Big Black boy. If a student was big, they had an increased risk. If they were big and Black, they had an increased risk. If they were Black, they had an increased risk. If they were big, Black, and a boy, they had one and they were a boy. What was amazing about this study was teachers had like eye scan. So teachers had to put these devices on, and they were told, hey, you're gonna have this trigger, this plumber, you're gonna push, and you're gonna push the button when a student misbehaves, right? Guess what? None of the students misbehave. But what was amazing was they were able to track the teacher's eyes, and the teachers spent the most time, both Black and white teachers, by the way, spent the most time on Black students. And many times they pressed the button because the student they thought was beginning to look like they might misbehave. They never misbehaved, but the teachers were prepping because they felt like that student was about to misbehave. And so we know that there's a connection with the fact that Black students are suspended from preschool at a higher rate than white students. And this study really unpacked the impact of implicit bias with elementary school Black students and teachers, both Black and white. Middle school. In middle school, there is a lot of research around the fact that being middle class does not protect Black males from still experiencing invisibility. So they are physically present in these spaces, but they do not feel like they are in those spaces. Their middle class status did not protect them from being treated differently. It didn't protect them from having their families being perceived, their involvement being perceived as undervalued. And so their experiences, despite sharing the same income level as their white peers, were still different. Race was playing a role in that. Let's talk about high school. I don't know if I have any school counselors here on this call, but I'm about to get right up in your right up on your porch and start knocking on your door. So Black students with identical transcripts are less likely to be recommended for AP classes. Teachers' expectations for Black students are oftentimes based on their race. So they either expect a Black student to act a certain way, to have a lesser amount of knowledge, to be able to engage in a way that is less than their white peers as it relates to rigorous curriculum. There was a study done here in the state of Ohio in a predominantly white district, and it was done with Black girls. And the Black girls reported that they were very much aware that there was a distinction in the expectations of how they were to behave in the school when compared to their white peers. And the expectation only made them behave in the way that they were expected. And sadly, when new Black girls would come into the school, if they exhibited the behaviors that didn't match the expectations that the other Black girls thought that they should have in the school, the Black girls didn't connect to the new Black girls. And so these are even out of classroom spaces where we see race kind of invading the way that our students are interacting in our spaces. It makes a big difference for their social integration into the school and how much they feel like they belong in the school. And how do we feel about students who internalize expectations in a way that they change their behavior and they're not free to be who they are like all the rest of the students? Like, those are the experiences our students are having. Let's talk about college. A lot of my research interest is around the college experiences, but I very much go through kind of these other experiences first to contextualize that. Black students, Black college students experience, and this is very well documented, experience racial discrimination and isolation so much that it impacts their perception of their campus climate. It is known to impact their academic progress. I have personally found that in my own research. Eventually, there is so much stress, tension, and trauma based on race when they go to college that many Black students start experiencing a sense of helplessness and self-doubt. And so there was some great research conducted by Dr. James Moore and my own husband. I'm gonna shout him out. Dr. James Moore created this theory. It's called Prove Them Wrong. And this theory is really about particularly Black males, about how they understand the stereotypes that are had about them in educational environments, their interactions with educators, and how they have to fight to prove educators wrong, that they're not stereotypical. My husband's research picked up off of that, and his research found, sadly, that there's also a let them be right syndrome, where we have our Black and brown boys who also recognize the stereotypes that are had about them. And because it takes so much effort to fight against them, they just sit back and say, well, let them be right. They know they're not right, but the effort to show them that they're not right is so much that they just, well, I'm gonna let them be right. Graduate school. Black graduate students generally require more support in college. Why? Well, they generally have less graduate preparation. So faculty and staff, counselors are not engaging Black undergraduate students in such a way that they can easily transition to graduate school. So they generally have some gaps. Black graduate students also have a lack of research opportunities. When we think about grants and research, the students that are typically pegged by faculty and other researchers are not going to be our Black and brown students. You know, it goes back into kind of what we're comfortable with, who's a better fit. They're not recommended for research opportunities. And then Black and brown students are chronically underfunded in their studies. So we think about funding. Graduate assistants, scholarships, those types of things. Black and brown students are historically receiving less funding and scholarship opportunities than white students. And then sadly, they experience very little faculty representation of people that look like them, which I will tell you in your classroom, in your school, across their educational experience, representation of people who look like students goes a long way in terms of their academic engagement and their academic persistence. So let's talk about when Black and brown people, they got that degree right, they should be good. They've been able to overcome, they have all these barriers, but they've been able to do it. When they get to careers, when we get to careers, we start experiencing the Black-white wealth gap. So Black people are paid less at every level across our experiences, high school, college, graduate, doesn't matter. Whatever degree we have, we are oftentimes compensated less than our white counterparts. And interestingly, the more education we obtain, the greater the gap, the greater the wealth gap, the greater the compensation gap. And then we get to retirement. The racial retirement wealth gap exists. And that basically talks about the amount of money that folks would have earned across their lifetime that puts, that money into their retirement. In 2019, it was determined that Black workers earned 14.9% less than their white counterparts. White workers with a college degree earned about $35.90, and Black workers earned about $30.35. So when we think about the impacts of implicit bias across the lifespan, we think about our students and all of these things. We think about their families, being some protective factors. They're experiencing direct impacts of our implicit bias, our unmitigated implicit bias. Their parents are experiencing that. Their grandparents are experiencing that. And our job is going to be to begin to disrupt those. So we're going to move on. So when we think about that colorblind ideology, we think about implicit bias and racism, we got to really start getting down to the meat of the issue. Racism is literally a Black and white issue. It's not just a Black and white issue, but it is a Black and white issue. Either you believe it exists or you don't. It's not an either or. It can't be in the middle. My husband says, Kenyana, you don't see gray. I don't see gray in a lot of things, but racism, there's no middle ground. Either you believe it exists or you don't. Either you believe that Black people are inherently flawed and white people are inherently superior, or you believe that we all have the same capabilities and we bring the same thing through the table, but they are factors and forces outside of us that impacts our ability to navigate through this life in the exact same way. Now, don't forget, our beliefs are grounded in what we learned, and what we learned developed our unconscious competencies. So the questions that we have to ask is, what competencies do we have that we don't know about? Those unknown competencies, and I can't stress this enough, they are considered our implicit bias. And if we don't disrupt and interrupt those inaccurate, incorrect, completely wrong conclusions that our minds have made, we will continue to perpetuate the myth that Black people are not as smart, that they don't work as hard, that they are inherently flawed, that Black students don't learn like white students. And we're going to continue making those connections that our students made in the Clark-Doll test. And we're going to continue engaging in segregative practices in our classroom that are fueled by our implicit bias. So let me talk with you about an example of how racially inaccurate conclusions are made and how we allow those to continue being alive in our mind. There has been a narrative that Black people are inferior, they're lazy, and they're just not equipped to pull themselves up on their bootstraps. You guys have probably heard that before. In 1965, there was a very legendary debate between James Baldwin, who is just a prolific Black writer, and William Murphy. And they had this debate, and it was about the fact that the American dream was available to all. Buckley made this major pronouncement. He said that there are generations of white Irish, white Italian, and white German immigrants who have pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, and African Americans need to do the same. Like, if they are not able to do that, then they must be inferior. And these are the conclusions that some of us have also had. But let me give you some backstory about how this may not be true, because we may have believed this, but it may not be true. At the end of the Civil War, there were Union leaders who met to determine what would happen to all the freed slaves. So I don't know if you all know that There were some slaves that also fought in the Civil War. And then of course it was over. So they said, okay, what are we gonna do with all these freed slaves? And this is how we hear about that conversation about 40 acres and a mule. If you've ever heard about that before, this is kind of where that concept came from. That 40 acres and a mule narrative came from, how are we going to compensate for slavery? And so an order was signed authorizing 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to be given to freed slaves. Now, the order allowed Black people to use it, but they couldn't own it. So here, our compensation is you can work this land, you can, take the crops and those types of things. So Southern whites and Confederates were eventually pardoned by Andrew Jackson for their engagement in this war after the death of Lincoln. And those pardons allowed Southerns the right to go back and reclaim the confiscated land as long as they pay their taxes, renounce the Confederacy, and swore their allegiance to the Union. So by 1867, all but 75,000 acres had been returned to the original landowners. So all of those 325,000 acres that freed slaves had been working and tilling and, producing on were taken from them. Did you know that only 8% of high school students are even aware that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War? And that Black people were also involved in fighting for their freedom against other people in the United States? I wonder how far this information would go, not only in our mind, in our lessons, and in the minds of our students, if we started really having some conversations about why we think students are inferior, or why we think Black people are inferior, and why we think they should pull themselves up on their bootstraps. I don't know if you ever heard of Black Wall Street, but Black Wall Street is, it's an amazing, and I will tell you, I've never read about it in a history book in school, and it is a part of our American history. Black Wall Street was this place where Black people were thriving. Of course, there was segregation, and so they created this economic powerhouse where they created Black businesses from everything that you can think of that operated in the 1940s and things like that, they had, and it was just their community. So researchers say that the Black dollar would stay in the Black community for 3 years before it ever exited, when there was Black Wall Street. And basically it was all Black owned businesses, big businesses to small businesses, movie theaters, people that fix shoes and those types of things. Black Wall Street was burned down by a group of white people who were angry. So when we start having conversations about inferiority and Black people pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, we look at this confiscation of land that Black people were working and putting things, their blood, sweat, and tears in that were confiscated. We look at Black Wall Street and we see all the Black wealth that was there that was violently taken. Our conversations might change a little bit about whether or not Black people are inferior. We think about many of the inventions that our Black inventors made to our American experiences that often aren't talked about in our classrooms. We talk about the major ones, but we don't talk about all those small ones, like a Black person inventing the way that we store and transport blood products that still impacts us today, that the Red Cross leveraged those inventions and practices in order to have blood products distributed all over the state. Think about all these people that are experiencing COVID and all of the different blood products that they are experiencing. A Black person created that mechanism. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that the person that created sanitary napkins was a Black woman. And I think women could appreciate that, but we don't have that. We don't have those discussions in our classroom, because the minute we start having discussions about the fact that Black wealth was made and it was possible, but it was violently taken over, the fact that we have all these prominent Black people who contributed not to Black history, they contributed to our American history, our conversations will start changing. There was a book that was written, I'm not sure if you all read it, I hope you have. It was called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And this book was based off of a scholar looking at 18 major prominent leading history texts that are used in our classroom. And what the writer found was that there were glaring omissions, there were flat out lies, and there was misinformation as it related to American history that our students are being taught. And so when we think about implicit bias, this is how we can get from those thoughts in our mind to getting them in those systems and down to paper and those types of things. Let's talk about the impacts, because they're major. We have mental stories. Our students have mental stories. They get rehearsed, they get refined, they get reinforced. It is damaging for our Black students to have these stories in their minds and perpetuated by our practices, our policies, and our actions. But let me tell you about the way that they're impacting these poor little brains and the development of their minds. So we think about the military. We all might be familiar with battle fatigue. Battle fatigue is just the stress from the battle. The symptoms are like exhaustion, decreased responsiveness, hesitancy, uncertainty, feeling disconnected, and just not quite focused. And we know that a lot of our military deal with this. I think we're very sensitive to this. We recognize that there are tremendous impacts of being engaged in physical and psychological warfare over a period of time. And many times our military were engaged in these types of things for 6 months, a year, some people 12, 18 months. There is a lot of wear and tear on our Black and brown students, their parents, their family. So wear and tear really talks about the toll that racism and our implicit bias has on the minds, the bodies, the psyches of our Black and brown students. Weathering talks about the wears and tears and the impacts on Black mothers. Remember, we talked about that mother, research about mothers, Black mothers and preterm birth. There's a lot of research that talks about premature Black women death being associated to the accumulation of racial trauma. And then we have this whole racial battle fatigue, very similar to the battle fatigue that our military men and women experience. We see reactions to this as emotional, physical, and even behavioral. Racial battle fatigue is experienced by our students and their families. And let me tell you the way that we can tell if there's an experience with that. If our students are demonstrating anxiety, anger, and depression, sometimes that's not associated with external factors outside of the classroom. Sometimes it's associated with stuff inside a classroom. There are physiological responses to racial trauma: headaches, high blood pressure, fatigue, and frequent illness. I know we talk a lot in education about students being ill, but I will tell you, in my own research, I have had Black students say, walking into my classroom makes me physically sick because of the racism and the racialized environment that is created, sometimes unknowingly and sometimes knowingly. And then there's a behavioral response. So racial battle fatigue also has, we might feel loss of appetite, quickness to argue, poor school performance, and impatience. And I will tell you that if this is not enough to get you to say, I'm in, let's do it, I'm not sure exactly what it would take. This racism, implicit bias impacts all of us across our experiences. And the burden that it places on Black and brown students and parents is significant. And so, well, what are we gonna do about this? We need to act like this is all about you. So we need to think like this is all about you, but we need to act like it's not about you. My son had a class trip one day. I was working with his classroom. I was volunteering, and we had to go buy like canned foods and stuff for a food pantry. That was like their service project. And so I volunteered for that trip. And I remember he was in second grade. I remember his teacher saying, we were getting ready to go and we were sitting in the classroom with their coats on. And she said, remember, this is not about you. And I was thinking, well, what is she talking about? It's kind of rude to say to kids. But what she was saying is, don't go in that store and start saying, oh, I like this, I like that, or don't start picking up things that's expensive. We got to be really lean. We got to spend this money. And they turned it into a competition where the group that got the most things with the least amount of money was going to win. And that's how we have to really think about this race work. We got to think like it's about us. Because if we're thinking like it's about us, then we're going to be more engaged in doing it. But we got to act like it's not about us. That means that we're not going to center the conversations on us, our feelings, our responses, and those types of things. We have to stop all of this cycle. We have to break it. We've got to cause there to be some interruption between, this implicit bias circle that our mind, it's like a tape that our mind plays. We got to start having conversations about race. And we got to start talking about what it looks like to be excluded, and then what it looks like to pull folks in. And we got to be willing to tell the full brutal story about what has really happened with us, with our students, our families, and our communities, and be willing to work through it. And so we think about the equity in the center, getting awake to woke to work. There's also a framework for kind of moving towards a more anti-racist position. And so remember, I asked you all about, like, what are your thoughts about having conversations about race? And there is this fear zone. That's kind of the first zone that we go into, where we're still kind of denying that racism is a problem. But remember, I told you it's a black or white issue. Either it is or it isn't. It's not in between. When we're in that fear zone, we're really avoiding those questions about race. We're living kind of in our racial comfort. We're still laying in that bed. We don't want to wake up yet. We avoid those hard conversations, and we just enjoy being around people that are like us. We like, feeling like she fits well with our team, or he fits well with our team. And we don't want to kind of interrupt that. Then we start moving to a learning zone. This is where we start recognizing that racism is a present and current problem. It's not just a historical problem. It's a current problem, which means we have to have a current solution. And that allows us to start seeking out information that makes us uncomfortable. It helps us to understand the privilege in ignoring racism. It helps us to move towards a place where we can educate ourselves about race and structural racism, our implicit bias, and those types of things. It allows us to be vulnerable about our own biases and our own knowledge gaps, because we do have them. And it allows us to put ourselves in a position where we are listening to others who think and look differently than us. We are actively engaging folks that we would normally say, not a good fit. And sometimes we're actively engaging with those students that we wouldn't normally refer for AP classes. We're engaging with those parents that we've made some conclusions about that weren't quite accurate. And then if we do that, we slide right into the growth zone. And this is where we just sit back, we put our legs up, and we're going to work through this discomfort. We're going to identify how people benefit from racism. We're going to promote and advocate for policies and practices in our classroom, in our building, in our district that are anti-racist. We're going to speak out when we see racism occur. Because let me tell you, if you have racism occurring and only the people that are affected by it are the ones that are addressing it, that's not enough. We got to start getting more voices into this choir. We have to educate ourselves about how racism harms our profession, because teaching education is a profession. And if we want to deal with the system, we got to really start talking about how it's done harm to our profession. And we don't let our mistakes deter us from doing better. We use them as building blocks. We yield our position of power to people who have been marginalized so that we bring them into the conversation. Because remember that quote I told you earlier, we're liberating together. We're linking hands together. We're not saving certain people. And we have to get uncomfortable. And if we do that, we can move forward. So what does it look like for us to move forward today? The first thing we need to do, I talked about it probably ad nauseum, is to figure out our implicit bias. The best way for us to do that is to take the Harvard implicit bias test. It's about implicit attitudes that we might carry that are either outside of our awareness, impacting our actions, but just completely unknown to us. The good thing about this test is you get a menu and you can actually select the type of test that you want. You can see I provided some examples on the screen. You can answer a series of questions and it'll give you results that will suggest to you the areas in which you need to build your awareness. It will uncover those biases for you. And so you can start kind of uncovering and addressing those. And this is when we can move from fully out of that fear zone, fully into that learning zone, and being fully awake and just saying, this is true, it is what it is, let's go ahead and start. But this also is a point where we can start from. This will help us start engaging in those conversations because we are now aware of what's going on in our mind. This will help us start selecting different resources and different books and podcasts. And I know there's a lot of things out there today that we can all use. But if we don't first uncover what's going on in our own minds, there's no way we're going to ever address the climate and culture in our building. There's no way we're ever going to positively impact our district, our institution, and those types of things. And so I have talked a lot. What I want you to do is to consider taking that test. You're going to be provided with all the links and resources that I've talked about in a Word document after this session. There'll be a link to that test if you like to take it. And I would suggest that everyone does it. I had to do it as part of my program. I do it periodically. I have some biases that I'm still working through that I found out from taking that because I want to make sure I'm honoring everyone in my practice. So we think about next steps. Next slide, please, Melissa. As a kind of a prelude to our next time together, we're really going to be thinking about our terms cultural awareness, cultural competence, cultural sensitivity, and cultural responsiveness, because our next step is to really think about what does implicit bias mean in our practice and how we're going to move to honor all of those different definitions of being aware, being activated, and then being responsive. And so that is what our next topic will cover when we get back together. You can go to the next slide. We're going to really look at using our new awareness. So I'm hoping that you all will have taken the implicit bias test by the time we get back together, using your new awareness as a tool. So we're going to try and build on that to make sure that we are implementing culturally responsive practices with our parents, our students, the folks that surround us in our district, and those types of things. And so we're going to go to the last slide. What are your questions? What are you wondering about? What thoughts do you have? What concerns do you have? How are you feeling? We have some time, so I can open up the floor for a couple questions, thoughts, and comments. Bye, David. Thanks for hanging with us. What questions can I answer?
Did you say you wanted them verbally?
I can.
I just want to thank you. What you've shared today has helped me to relieve some personal burdens and to understand better the role I play in supporting young people in reaching for their goals. And I'm very grateful for this space you've created. Thank you.
It is our pleasure.
Yeah.
It is our pleasure. What else? Whose questions can I answer? I'm going to school psychology, you all. We don't say, are there questions? We say, what questions can I answer?
Dr. Walker, do you have any summer courses that you offer?
So our, Melissa, can you put the ready link in there? Our center, the team I'm on, the Equity Engagement Evaluation team, we do a lot of work internally, but we also do work externally. And we have some products on our website, some of which I've discussed today. There are YouTubes that we have made. There's PowerPoint presentations, and they're all different types of resources, Barbara, that you can link to. As you know, this is the hottest topic right now. And so there's a major demand for interactive things like this. And so what we've done is we want to reach as many people as possible. And we believe that if the people are hungry, we feed them. but we got to be very creative with the way that we feed folks because we can't feed everybody. We don't have food for everybody. And so this event today and next month will allow us to kind of do some of this. So I'll be with you all up until May if you continue joining. And then you can link to our website for other resources. So in a sense, no, I teach graduate students urban issues in education, but there are resources available that you can kind of pull off of on our website. And then I'll be sending you guys some resources as well. But that's a good question. What other questions can I answer? Thank you, Ms. Brown. I'll be back with you all in April and May. Yes. And then I think we're going to also record a podcast, right? And so we'll do some follow-up with that podcast, I think next week or following week. And so we can address some of your questions or thoughts then too.
For sure. So if you want to send us questions, things that we can pass on, perhaps if you're more reticent to like speak out loud in the group or write in the chat, we can certainly do that. And we'll try to make sure that we get that along to Dr. Walker so that you can answer those during the podcast. We'll give you about another minute or two if anyone has questions.
I'm trained to let the,
yeah, I know her wait time.
You're welcome, Cindy.
And Dr. Walker, I'd like to ask another question. I've read a number of books about the racial divide, you know, from caste to stamped to blackout, the Yellow House, and I have the book to the 400 Souls.
That's new. You got that too? Ooh, that's fresh.
Got that one, and also the Sum of Us. So out of that, you know, I certainly have learned a lot of history, but is there one that you would recommend as kind of being the top priority?
Let's see, Melissa, are you in here? I'm going to answer and I'll let Melissa answer. I think anytime we can find culturally accurate, historically accurate text that allows us to really revisit in our mind the experiences of all people groups in these United States of America is going to be the best thing. So there are some of those like stamp, they take a historical perspective, but I think sometimes it just really helps us to understand the gaps that we had in our understanding of race, because sometimes we fill those gaps in with things that weren't accurate. So I would suggest that if you have the tolerance, some of those books are dense. That kind of exploring the historical kind of events that have occurred related to race here would be good. But then also pairing that with kind of just some personal building tools, I think would be good as well. Melissa, you got some thoughts?
I would add the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. He does, I think, an excellent job of setting the historical context, as Kenyon just talked about, but also does a lot of kind of contrast setting and giving specific ideas about what it looks like to be racist or versus anti-racist. And I think for me, because as Kenyana said, even though I'm Black, I too have self-reflection that I need to do. It was a great way to ground my understanding, but then positioned me and gave me inquiries that helped me to self-reflect and think about where I sit in things, and also get a sense of what it would look like if I stationed myself in a different position.
Jack, your question, oh my goodness, this is a great question. So Jack is asking a question about resistance and discussions around representation and tokenism when it comes to literature and media. And then how do we address this issue in our classrooms? And I do, representation does feel like a dirty word. So I recently actually wrote a book chapter. It's college level based, but it goes over this particular thing, Jack. Sometimes when we're trained, so I told you I'm married to an educator. So when we're trained in our professions, particularly let's just say in our teaching profession, we got those go-to, books and things, right? We got the curriculum that's set by the district or the building. But sometimes we don't explore the contours and the confines of contributions of other intellectuals that can also contribute to that conversation. So it looks like we are bringing in kind of tokenism text, but if we, and we're going to talk about this more, I think this is session 3, if we start undergirding all of our educational practices with an eye towards equity, we'll start selecting text, alternative text, activities. We'll start having conversations. We'll start including folks that we may not historically have included in these conversations, where it doesn't feel like it is outside of what we're learning, but is inside of what we're learning. It is a part of the curriculum that we are unfolding. It's not highlighted during Black History Month and those types of things. And I think if we're thinking about tokenism inside the classroom, so we'll talk about with students, because we can see that in representation in curriculum, but also bodies. Just being careful when we do start having those conversations that are very racially charged. But man, if we demystified race, do you know how easy it would be to have those conversations in the classroom where we're not talking about slavery and everybody turns to the Black student? Those types of things. And even when we provide students options. So I think about our elementary school students, we provide them options for people they want to represent or emulate, that the list includes everybody. And so that someone like myself, I often found as a very well-educated parent who is married to an educator, found myself having to have difficult conversations with teachers about why they didn't have Black women figures for my daughter to be for their living wax museum. And I had to have the conversation, like, we need to expand this list. So I think that first thing is building our awareness. And then we'll start looking at curriculum, implementation of curriculum, classroom activities. We'll look at those a little bit differently. Our sensitivity will be so nuanced that we'll start thinking, I wonder how this would impact, whatever your student's name is. I wonder how this activity would impact this student. And then also, let's not forget the power of our parents' feedback. Parents sometimes are aware of activities, curriculum, and things that would feel very culturally appropriate for their kiddos. Interest surveys, not a needs assessment, but just kind of getting a pulse of materials that parents are aware of that maybe we're not aware of, or other educators. We really look at this whole idea of cultural brokers. So cultural brokers are used for a variety of things. We're seeing a lot of them right now with the COVID vaccine. And what cultural brokers do is they are a bridge between whatever it is we're trying to get done in the community we're trying to get it done with. And so we're seeing that with the coronavirus, where we're having Black physicians getting their vaccine on TV, where they're bringing out the Black scientists. Now, some people would say that's tokenism. Why are they bringing that Black scientist out there and have her talk about that? Well, we need to see that sometimes. And so having culture brokers in education, having colleagues, if you don't have Black colleagues in your building, having colleagues in your district that you can, approach and just say, hey, I would love to collaborate on making sure I am covering all my bases as it relates to, whatever students. Now, I will say, Melissa and I are a little different. You have Black people, and I think, Mr. Moore alluded to this. You have Black people who have experienced racial trauma over a period of time, and they just don't have it in them to be a culture broker. They just don't have it. They can't do it. So you will have Black people, professionals, maybe some of your colleagues that will say, I'm not going to be your teacher. That's not my job. And then you'll have some Black people say, I'd rather you learn it in an accurate way. And so I will join hands with you. Our approach has been, we will link hands. This is a world problem. This is a US problem. This is a people problem. So it's going to take all different kind of people to help solve this thing. And so if you can locate colleagues that will work as a culture broker for you, that would also be very helpful. I hope that answered your question. I feel like I went all the way around the mulberry bush on that one. I don't know about signups. That would be not my
Yeah, I responded to that. I was saying that
Thank you.
they're currently in STARS, I believe, the April 13th one. And the May one should be in as well. So please sign up. I'll also throw in a plug for evaluations. We would really greatly appreciate it if you will complete the evaluations. In fact, we will check to see if you do, and we will be gatekeepers for the next one.
Woo,
if you
uh-oh.
don't.
Yeah, let the people in, they want to eat.
I know. That's kind of anti the message that's been happening today. So, so we won't do that. But please do. And I know that Dr. Walker has their own evaluation that they do from their center that will be sent as well, correct?
We will send you one question.
Oh, just one.
Just one. Just one. Y'all are busy. Hey, I'm married to an educator. I know your schedules. When he's in the building, I call, I'm busy. Okay. So one question. If you click on this one question, we don't need to know anything else. We just need you to answer that one question.
That was so kind of theirs. Ours is definitely more than one, but please fill it out still. We'd appreciate it.
It looks like there was a question about a connection between religion and race, faith and race, I'm sorry. That's a good question. So I think if we look at race, if we look at Black, white, for example, you have the church has been, the Black church, I should say, has been involved in race work for quite some time. If we think about the civil rights, we just think about churches in general, the way that they operate religion-wise in Black churches is Black churches generally were on the forefront of racial issues. They were a part of the civil rights movement, but they're also part of creating a space where Black people can essentially go in and lick their wounds of racism. They provide a place of healing and comfort. And so for many Black people, their connection between their identity as being Black and kind of racism is intertwined with their faith, not all. But then there's this new group of generation people. Y'all know my children are in that group. Whoo, they're a different breed, but they feel like their religion is not doing enough to deal with race. And so they're kind of detaching from that because they're seen as very antiquated and is not really dealing with real issues. I have some colleagues who are religious and they engage in faith-based worship who are white. And it's the same way. Either their churches are addressing it and they've been addressing it, they're talking about it head on, they're saying, let's get ourselves together, or they're not. And so, they're hiding behind their faith and their religion so as not to deal with that because race is seen as a political thing. And so we're not going to engage in that conversation or that practice. So. All right, thank you, Kim. So I think that marks my time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. We really appreciate your time and imparting so much knowledge. I know I can just speak for myself that my brain is full, but also I have to say my heart is full too. So thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and wisdom.
Mm-hmm. You are welcome. I'm gonna leave you guys with this thought. I think I've shared it before. I am a marathon runner. I love running marathons. I had hip surgery, so I had to negotiate with my surgeon that I could still run, but not run marathons. My first marathon was in Columbus, and I had trained, and I trained with music because I have to have a cadence. And I started running, and my music was interrupted by something. I couldn't figure out what it was. I was like, what the heck is that? I took my headphones out, and it was the patter of feet all going in the same direction. And it was amazing to be in a crowd of thousands of people that were running towards the exact same thing. And we were fueling each other to keep going and keep moving and those types of things. If we can get this ripple effect to go, the noise that we will make, the change that we will make in trying to get to the exact same place, that is how impactful I think this work can be when we kind of join in together and say, we're going to do this. So thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you all. We're in this fight together. I'm running towards the same mark that you are, and I hope to see you back in April.
You said it best. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and being engaged. We really do appreciate that as well. Can't wait to see you all in April on the 13th. Feel free to sign up now if you haven't. All right,
Thank you.
bye.